maybe on down the line. We can spend a little time. I promise to notice you. Yeah. Cause knowing you, knowing me isn't good. I so love for you. Yeah, so you take you're always on my mind. I so love for you. Leave me and you have to keep me satisfied.
Hi there, everybody. I hope everyone's still checked in and online. I know it gets tough with these virtual conferences, but you've got some really exciting stuff to listen to. We're still collecting shoes, still over 500 pairs. Please, if you're thinking about it but not sure, make the pledge. We'd be very excited to put more shoes on more young children that can't afford to buy them themselves. So thanks very much. Those two buildings that you saw there, two redevelopments in the IHS Fund 2 portfolio, one in Linwood and Pretoria, which as you can see is only gutted and not rebuilt, and then Marshall Yards in the CBD of Johannesburg, which has been built and tenanted and looking great. When we started working on what to do for this year's conference, we thought we had to definitely have a panel that focused quite sharply on the township economy. The township economy was quite hard hit in the July riots, and it was worth scratching and seeing what's there and seeing how massive it actually is. And when you talk about the township economy, a name that comes up a lot is Gigi Alcock. Gigi is an outright specialist in the township economy, and I've learned a lot just by talking to him and others on the panel. That the township economy is not the local spaza shop. There's a lot more to it than that. Gigi has an extremely interesting story. So those of you that don't know his story and haven't heard him speak before or haven't read any of his books, I think you're going to be fascinated by what he has to say. So welcome, Gigi. I did ask him when we met previously what Gigi actually stands for. And I'm going to ask him to tell that story to start, because obviously he was raised in rural KwaZulu-Natal quite unconventionally as far as a normal white lad growing up is concerned. But I'm going to ask him to tell you that story. So thanks for coming through. Gigi will have a talk now, and then after the short break before lunch, he will be on that panel led by Solly and Mboweni, and some very, very interesting insights. Thanks, Gigi.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Yeah, where did Gigi come from? So I grew up in a mud hut in a Zulu village in a place called Msinga in KwaZulu-Natal. My parents were political activists who believed the only way to really change people's lives was to live like them. So they built a mud hut, no running water, no electricity, and brought us up like Zulu kids. And in fact, my mother still lives just like that. She walks to the Tigela River to wash, and still lives in the same mud hut we grew up in. We grew up incredibly poor, but rich in terms of understanding the cultures and the lifestyles around us. And why Gigi? So in Zulu, you're named after a characteristic or an event. So my brother was called Makonya, which means to make a loud noise. When I was born, when I was a baby, my parents were fighting forced removals where the government was bulldozing people's houses and moving them out into the Bantustans. And because my mother had me on her hip and trying to stop these bulldozers, and of course the bulldozers and the trucks all had a registration GG, which stood for Government Garage. So I was named Iskatska GG, the time of GG. And Gigi stuck. Everyone called me Gigi. My mother, no one's ever called me anything else. And so I was the first personalized number plate in this country. Cool. So to Gasinomics. So I'm going to talk about the economics of the informal sector, of the townships, and I call this Gasinomics. Primarily because the perception of township economies and informal economies with the unsophisticated, disorganized, small scale, and none of these are true. The reality is that there are massive economies in this space. There's very dynamic spaces, and we need to think of it differently, as I'll illustrate just now. And really the future of economic activity in Africa, but particularly in South Africa, and the opportunity for creating employment and economic growth lies very much in those spaces. And I call one of my books Gasinomic Revolution as a reference to this revolution happening in this space. So I'm going to just start with a little intro into that and then move very much into the kind of housing space in relation to the theme of this conference. So if we look at this what I call the Gasinomic sectors, a multitude of sectors in this space. And most people tend to think that the township economy is rows and rows of spazas or rows and rows of hawkers. But let's just look at the scale. And I'm going to go through this quite quickly. There's in essence about 100,000 spazas, or what I call spazarettes. These are supermarket type spazas, turning over about 150 billion rand a year. So a massive sector, and the spazarette sector in particular, these supermarket type spazas, have completely transformed the spaza sector and are increasingly challenging the formal retailers. After that, there's about 50,000 gasikos, as I call them, fast food outlets. This goes from something called a Kota to Shisanyama's, to Amabledi, and so on and so forth. This sector turns over 90 billion rand a year. So this is over and above the spaza sector. And while the spaza sector is dominated by immigrants, the gasikos, or fast food out of home sector, is dominated by South Africans, 99% South Africans. Then there's a massive hawker sector, tabletops, mobile sellers, about 500,000. The typical seller making anywhere from 3,000 rand a month to 10,000 rand profit a month. So again, not really subsistence, making relatively good money. 150,000 muti traders. These are herbal medicines, turning over 18 billion rand a year. You see these guys under bridges and muti shops and stuff. Another massive sector. Spaza and backroom rental. I'll come back to backroom rental a bit later, but spaza, this immigrant spaza sector rents from South Africans, and so we in essence have a sector with about 25 billion rand in spaza rental paid to South Africans. And then we have about 20 billion rand paid in backroom rental. Another sector which we all know and love, about 250,000 taxis, turning over about 50 billion rand a year. and doing more than 15 million kilometers a month in terms of transport, a huge sector, very little support from the government. Hair salons and stylists, about 50,000 of these, turning over about 10 billion rand. Salons and stylists, almost 100,000 of these. And I can carry on. 80,000 auto traders, township gussie mechanics, panel beaters, and other auto people involved in the auto sector. And then the liquor industry, which again is relatively well known in terms of licensed taverns and shebeens, about 45,000 of those. So if we look at those sectors, we have a massive range of sectors. And I'm not even going to go into some other ones, the gussie building sector, which I'll talk a bit about now, which everything from renovations, gates, burglar guards, and so on, services, plumbing, electricians, catering and event suppliers, the whole, I mentioned the muti industry, but there's a whole other sector around funerals, unveilings, and so on. Rental sector I mentioned, and the financial sector, the Stokvels as an example, which is a 45 to 50 billion rand sector with almost 1 million Stokvels. So a number of these, and in essence, what I say is small is the new big. The reality is that this sector is represented by a multiple range of different sectors. Within these sectors, there's also a multitude. If you aggregate these sectors in terms of a multitude of relatively small to medium-sized businesses, you end up with very, very large sectors that are driving our economy. That when we see the unemployment figures, my argument's sake is I argue that these things are not considered in our numbers. But when we look at the townships also, we need to look at them differently. You know, I kind of say this is the Melrose Arch, this image over here of the township, but it's actually more Mam Velasi's arch. And Mam Velasi is a Goko who lives in the little white four-room house in that image there. And I went to visit her and asked her to show me around her business. And she was like, "What business?" And I explained, and she said, "When are you dangerous? What do you know about our businesses?" And anyway, she walked me around. And if you look at the image there on the left-hand side is what's called a Dunusa salon. Dunusa salon because it's a Dunusa means bare bum. When you wash your hair, your bum is bare in the street. And she rents that Dunusa salon for 1,500 rand a month. In the next to it is a stone where there's a lady who sells gib-gibs, shrum-shrums, and other snacks. And I said, "Do you rent out that stone?" She was like, "I can't rent out that stone." Then she showed me next to it was the guy who repairs alternators and starter motors for the taxi industry. He rents that table out for 500 rand a month, and then he stores his stuff in the back. On the right-hand side, is a Shisanyama, buy and bri. She rents it out for 1,500 rand a month. And then behind her house, she has 3 back rooms. One's called E-flat, and the other 2 are called Amaroom. And the E-flat she rents out for 1,500 rand a month, and the Amaroom she rents out for between 900 and 1,000 rand a month. So if we look at that space there, we're talking about a multi-use, that little 4-room house on the corner of the street in Soweto is actually everything from the hair salon, the Shisanyama, the back room, and so on and so forth. So we need to start thinking differently about these spaces because they're not just only residential. And when you see the development of these spaces, they do not follow typical kind of patterns that we're used to in a more Western suburban space. The other thing about this space is we have massive misconceptions about it. And when I ask people, well, what is the percentage of people who live in shacks like these in South Africa, I get huge figures. You know, what is the percentage of households in South Africa who live in informal dwellings? I get 30, 50, 60, 80%. The reality is the vast proportion of people in South Africa across the board, including townships, live in formal dwellings. And I'll go through this very quickly. This is from SA General Household Survey, which is a very interesting tool. But more than 80% of households in South Africa actually live in formal dwellings, and around 12 to 13% of these live in informal dwellings. So only about 12% of our society live in informal dwellings, and that is the same in the township space. The other important thing, and it's relatively small, I'll just read out on the left-hand side is households are growing faster than the population, driven by the fact 1/4 of households consist of one person. So if you look there, single people, 25.7%. In fact, this is General Household Survey 2019. Nuclear households, in essence, a household with parents and kids makes up 40% of all households in South Africa. And I won't go through all the rest, but the reality is that the vast proportion of people in the township spaces in South Africa of households are small households or nuclear, as a single households, 1/4, or 40% are nuclear households, and they all live in majority informal dwellings. So we have to change our mindsets around these spaces. This is a picture I took in Soweto and Diepkloof in about 1994. And of course, this typical 4 rooms, there's the smoke, coal smoke coming out the chimney from the Welcome Dover coal stove that was popular in all of these. The perception is that this is how townships look today. And the reality is there's been incredible transformation of housing. In fact, if you look, here you have, the complete range in a street where the 4-room houses, if you look in that top street there next to the house with the dish, there's a little 4-room. That would have been the typical 4-room of every house in that street. And the same with the picture in the bottom. And there's been this transformation from ama 4-room to an extended 4-roomy, and then now I'm a big house. Not sure where the names come from. Anyway, the reality is that this is what streets have done. And development doesn't happen in these spaces in a linear fashion where we have a high income suburb or townhouses only and so on. There's this kind of linear transformation that happens. And just looking at ama 4-room as an example, the bottom left there is a typical 4-room. But if you look at that, look at the wonderful one on the top there, tiled the walls all around, and on the right-hand side with face brick and that lovely garden and so on. And these are everywhere. The picture on the bottom right is Khayelitsha. The one on the left, I think, is in Durban, in Umlazi or Wamashu. The reality is that this is changing, and people don't sell their homes and move into a larger home. They develop the homes where they live. At the same time, we have this massive backroom sector. As I mentioned earlier, 20 billion rand is earned by South African households in backroom rental. And we've in essence gone from a stage where backrooms were primarily built for family members, teenage sons, and so on, to where these are increasingly businesses. And people, like the picture on the bottom left in Soweto, building multiple story units that are used for backrooms. So we have this massive backroom rental sector, primarily residential, but some of them, like the bottom there, a little hair salon. And why would this happen? Why this growth? Well, if you revert back to the figures I showed, which says that the vast proportion, 25.7% of households in South Africa are single people households. And then after that, the next level is actually a mother and 1 or 2 kids. And then after that, we have the nuclear family of around, mother and father and 2 kids. This tells us why you would suddenly need these ama room, because it's reflective of the current population, and not what we've historically been said, that township people are large households, multi-generational households, all living in the same space. That was true 20 years ago. It still exists, but it is not the majority anymore. The other thing is that I talk about Gasipolitans, is that there's this, in fact, I used to talk about Afropolitans. Afropolitans being people who are culturally African, at the same time ultra-modern. Now I talk about Gasipolitans, and this has been driven to a large extent by things like lockdown. And these are people who are ultra-modern, sophisticated, relatively well-off middle-class people, but who are rooted in the township. And if we look at what has happened, and I was involved in politics many years ago, there was an assumption when the Group Areas Act was killed off and so on, all the apartheid residential laws were stopped, there was an assumption that the townships would become ghettos. In essence, people would, the townships were built as dormitories. You lived there, you slept there, but you went to work for your productive part of your life. And so that once you could live anywhere you wanted, you'd leave the township, you'd move out. Culturally, people prefer to live in the townships. In fact, a guy said to me a while ago, he's a very well-off guy, lives in Bryanston. I kept bumping into him in a township. I said, what are you doing here all the time? He said, I sleep in the suburbs, but I live in the townships. And the reality is that the social, cultural, spiritual, and other things mean that the space is actually a space that people in many ways prefer to live in. And when they don't live in the township, they literally move just to the edge of the townships, like places like Naturena and other suburbs on the edges of, for argument's sake, Soweto. But this space is also driven culturally in terms of what are the things that people prefer. I mean, look at these streets here. There's the Forum, there's the Mansion, and so on, the Mkuku, the RDP, and the fancy big house next to it. The other thing about the space, people, as I said, don't move out of these spaces. So there's a continuum of development. There's a shack settlement called, used to be an RDP shack settlement called Bram Fisher near Dobsonville in Soweto. If you go to Bram Fisher today, 10 years ago, it was shacks and RDP houses. If you go to Bram Fisher today, it looks like one of these streets of double stories, large houses, and so on. Go to any shack settlement, and Khayelitsha, if you want, the reality is that people are continually developing these spaces, and so they grow incredibly fast. And what we see is this constant extension and renovation of these places. So you start with a shack or an RDP or a Forum, and then what you do is you extend it. The typical thing people do is they add the bigger windows. Then they add a fancy door, like what's called a kingdom door, swings on a central pivot kind of thing, and they add elaborate burglar guards. You find very few burglar guards in the township that are just these basic things. It's about these elaborate burglar guards. Then you add a garage, which is actually a room or e-flat, or you add back rooms. And then what you do is you build over and consume this Forum, and I'll show you some pictures of it just now. But in essence, you don't leave the Forum when you decide to make it into a mansion. You stay in it and you build over this space. You build multi-levels, and then you buy out, if you can, or next door. Or next door being, of course, the neighbors, who you buy out and then move on to their stand as well. And you see this happening perpetually, this massive amount of renovation, extension, growing, and moving from this. So when we look at informal dwellings, there's a new shack settlement arrives and starts being put up, whether it's a squatter or site and service, whatever, just know that very quickly that will start transforming itself. So how does building happening in the space? So the first thing that happens is you never go to a builder and you get a quote and he then goes off and you get a loan, or you pull some money off your bond and you go and pay him to do it. In essence, you get a builder who comes there and he's been referred to you first of all, because this is what happens in the township. And then he does the calculations and he gives you a list. He says, this is what my labor will cost you, and this is the building material you need. And then you go off and you will then go to Cash Build, Builder's Warehouse, a local builder's yard, and you will then go and you will get a quote for that material that you need. And when you get the quote, you will then start paying for that until you have the material. Once you've got all the material on site, you then phone the builder and said, okay, I'm ready, you must come and build now. So you must imagine these are things that people are saving for, planning for over a long period. Very different way of doing things. And there's a multitude of these builders in the township, whether they're doing like their silicon paint, no-way burglar guards. There's people in everything from the car industry to things like chrome gutters and pillars are hugely popular as well. And you generally will go to these people in these spaces. And these are generally very competent builders or renovators who understand how to do things in these small spaces, how to do things when you still live there while they're renovating and so on. And for me, the tragedy is that these are the builders and the people in the construction industry we should be utilizing, because they exist in this massive kind of space. This is a house where the owner finished. He did the foundation and the walls, and then he ran out of funds to continue. He couldn't buy the additional materials he needed. And so he's waiting for the Stokvel to pay out. Now, how are houses financed in this space? There's no such thing as home loans. There's a range of different things, one I call brick by brick home loans. But the primary way houses are financed, the first is lay-by, which I think is terrible. I mean, instead of now getting a loan and then building your house and paying off the loan, every month you take 1,000 Rand or whatever it might be, and you pay the building supplier, building material supplier. You're going to get interest on that. And of course, you carry on paying after 6 months. You've paid for that material. Then he delivers it to you, and then you get it built. The other one is stokvel, and that's actually the most common one. And the big misconception about stokvels is that these are savings groups of gogos who are putting money together to buy groceries at the year end. About 14 to maximum 20% of stokvels are buying group stokvels. The vast majority of stokvels, or what they call Ama Society, are actually savings and investment groups. And the vast proportion of stokvels lend as much as they save. This was a group in Pietermaritzburg I took the photos of in a shack settlement that 80,000 Rand in savings in their stokvel, and they had it in a plastic Edgar's bag. You can see there on the Gansia on the grass mat. And when I arrived, they only had 20,000 odd Rand in that bag. I said, "Where's the rest?" They said, "Oh, sometimes we have none because we lend it out." And they were counting that money out. The woman on her knees was counting the money out for the woman on the chair who'd finished tiling her house with the last loan that she'd since repaid and now wanted to buy stuff for the inside of her home. Microcredit is another one. 3 and 5% interest a month is what typical micro unsecured credit costs. Again, I mean, you're not going to build a house paying 3 to 5% a month on that loan. But the most dominant thing is what I call brick by brick home loans. I wrote about this in Gastronomic Revolution. In essence, monthly people go and buy things. So in the old days, you know, the Dogolosh used to, you had the bed on cans or bricks because the Dogolosh lived under there. Today, you don't have the Dogolosh under there. You have tiles, you have bags of cement and whatever it might be. So what you do is, in essence, you start off by buying things that don't get damaged outside: bricks, concrete mix, and tiles, and so on and so forth. And then towards the end of the time, you start getting things like cement and stuff. And once you've done that brick by brick home loan and you've got this the stuff ready, you phone the builder. Sometimes you just have one room ready, and then he builds the one room. In fact, I visited a home when they had a huge slab and a little room on the one side. I said, "Yo, did they make a mistake?" And the owner of the house said, No. She said, "There's my lounge, there's the kids' room, there's the kitchen," and so on. She was, in essence, building this massive slab with this dream and this vision. She was building cathedrals. She was eventually going to end up with this, but she was building it literally a room and a room at a time. So I love the please bring your proof of residence. A lot is said about title deed, and a lot is said about creditworthiness. And so on of these spaces. And the mistake we make is we confuse ownership and title deed. We have in our Western mindset that the only proof of something is title deed. This piece of paper says you own this place, and you own it because of this piece of paper, and you can sell it or use that as security or whatever it might be. We have to look at it differently in these spaces. This is a house in Mamelodi and near Pretoria. And I've saw this picture, and here is this massive house being built over the 4-room. This is the typical way you extend. And I chatted to the lady of the house, and I said, "I love the way you're doing this, and it's going to be a really big house." And she said, "Yo, we struggle to get permission for this." So I said, "What, from the municipality?" She said, No, from Gogo. She says, "This is Gogo's house." So I said, "Well, why did she take so long to give you permission?" She said, "Gogo died 5 years ago. So we've been going to the Sangoma and saying, 'Sangoma, please talk to Gogo and get her permission to extend the house.' And we only got it just the other day." Now, that is a whole spiritual thing I won't go into about ancestors and importance of their approval and so on. But can you imagine that person actually deciding, because they couldn't pay on their home loan or whatever, they were prepared to forfeit that house? The bonds to that property are so powerful, they will do anything they can to not lose that because of that connection. And so what is the risk here? In essence, based on that, there is zero risk you would ever have in these spaces. So we need to, again, think about things like credit worthiness and these kind of things in a completely different way. Another big part of this is the cash kind of economy in terms of buying houses. You find most spaza shops have all these little adverts placed on them. Room to rent Ivory Park near Full Gospel Church, WhatsApp and call. Looking for RDP, house to buy, cash, Mkuku for sale as a business or a home. So there's a thriving sector in this of a rental on the one hand, but also of buying and selling these spaces for businesses or for living in, and so on. So, but all completely informal, all done in this kind of informal way, and yet a really large sector within that space. The other thing about these spaces is that these are actually, one of the other people in the panel earlier said, these are homes, not houses, and it's exactly, stole my words. These are homes, not houses. And we need to think differently about these kind of things. So as an example, these are two houses, shacks, look inside the shack. That was a little 4-room. That was her kitchen inside of that space. And when we look at these houses, generally people are spending also large amounts of money on furnishing these houses, on decor within these spaces. And there's, again, another big sector that just is in home and decor within these. This is in Tembisa. So these would be typical houses. I did some work with one of the suppliers of home decor and stuff like this, a large chain. And we went to hundreds and hundreds of homes and developed this kind of thing of what the typical, and these were typical township homes, furnishing in these homes. And there's certain styles and decor that people like, and then elaborate and lovely inside. So, when we drive past that place, inside it's a home and it's elaborately furnished, and pictures of certificates and school kids and Gogo standing in her church uniform and so on. And one of the houses I went into was this house here, and she didn't have the ceiling, as you can see there. And I was like, what, why didn't you do the ceiling? She said, I'm waiting for the Stokvel to pay out. Then I'm going to do my ceiling. So I said, yeah, but ceilings aren't expensive. You just get some boards and you put them up. She said, boards, just cheap ceiling. Never. She's waiting for the Stokvel to pay out because these are the ceilings of the townships. One of the things that people spend most money on in the townships are ceilings. These elaborate ceilings in little homes. I mean, we used to have them in the old days with the pressed kind of steel ceilings. Look at these ceilings. And there's very few township homes you will go into that don't have these ceilings. And when we build houses like in the inner city and these kind of places, that we are trying to attract people from these township spaces who are culturally African, who come out of a township, Gasipolitans if you want. Do we give them the ceilings they want? Do we plan these when we do architectural designs and so on? I suspect we probably don't. And these are inside the homes, the lovely bedrooms, elaborate curtains and so on, and the bathrooms that we looked at. And the thing I love most about the bathrooms is many of them had these basins in the baths. And people said these are because I prefer to wash in a basin. I've always washed with a mfatugo and a basin. So I put the basin in the bath and then I use the basin. And again, it was a cultural nuance that many of the people, particularly the more older generation, prefer to bath in that way. And of course, the people in the township who are selling stuff know this is what it is. And so, he has a fairly decent income environment where people have got baths and showers and so on, and yet they're doing a thriving trade in plastic basins because they understand this kind of lifestyle element. In the townships as well, businesses and residential merge. So one of the things is over lockdown, we found that many of these gastronomic businesses survived because in the top right there is a hair salon next to the forum. The left-hand side, the Mini being repaired with the engine out on the pavement next to the home. The Healer Profit. And the one in the bottom right that I love, I mean, that's the fancy house there. Then they have a chemist on the far right and a fast food joint next to it. So the reality is that when we plan for these spaces and when we and when we consider these spaces, we need to consider that business and residential, like Mamvelasi's Arch, these places merge. And do we consider that? Because when we build RDP settlements or new suburban settlements, they have no spaza shop, they've got no Gota outlet, they've got no hair salon. And these things we see, they start following on because no one's actually allocated the space. So the Somali rents RDP and turns it into a spaza, and then the South African does a fast food outlet and so on, but inside these residential spaces. And this is an important kind of consideration. It's become trendy in the upmarket spaces to have, business, social, entertainment, residential side by side. Well, why not in these spaces as well? The same goes for events. You don't hire a conference center. This is a baby shower in next to a little forum and a tiny little space, and there was the elaborate tables and chairs. When you have a funeral, an unveiling ceremony, a wedding, a baby shower, any of these events, you don't hire a conference center, you do it on the space. You get permission, you put the marquee over the road, you close off the road, all the neighbors are happy with it. Can you imagine in my suburb if that happened? And you have your party there. Again, do we consider this? Do we plan and consider this in terms of what we think about? Another big area is rural frontier towns. These are towns like Mthatha, Pongola, Mqanduli, Pudalichaba, and so on. And these are towns where there's massive business happening. So we're not just talking townships. If you look at these rural areas, they're thriving areas. In top right there is Lusikisiki at end of May last year, at the peak of the serious lockdown. That's the kind of amount of stuff that's happening. And what is happening in these rural towns is there's an aggregation of homes, people moving out of the rural area closer to these rural towns. And I call them frontier towns because they're kind of these beachheads inside massive rural areas. And I came from Tugela Ferry in KZN. I mean, this is outside the edge of Tugela Ferry. And you can see this transformation from traditional dwellings to fancier, larger homes, and this rapid growth of these kind of more upmarket, brick and tile and corrugated iron homes, literally in these deep rural areas. And Msinga is considered it's officially the poorest district in South Africa. And yet this is the kind of development that is happening in those spaces. And forget about more upmarket areas. There's an amazing transformation happening within housing in these spaces. So to end, just very quickly, I think that the first thing is about financing. Let's look at it differently, especially around renovations and improvements, enabling and empowering Gasi builders. Are we building to styles and desires of the homeowner, kind of reach for the ceiling? Different forms of risk and ownership, needing to ask Gogo and never wanting to lose Gogo's house. And how do we consider hybrid residential, social, and small business? The other big thing, and I say the same for people who are doing furniture and decor and stuff, IKEA in Europe has specialized in supplying kind of furniture and stuff that is for a tiny little one-room kind of bachelor flat thing. Why aren't we looking at these kind of things for small or single household homes? Because this is the growing dynamic there. And most importantly, I think this gastronomic revolution, this gastronomic economy is changing this sector and will continue to change that sector. Thank you.
Much, Gigi. Some fascinating, for us as housing people, so much stuff that we need to think about differently that that you've given us another perspective. You know, everything from designs to financing to locations to what else needs to be in the scheme. You know, so making little places for the hairdresser, little places for the spaza shop, and those kinds of things. I think we've got a lot to think about, but hopefully we'll hear a lot more on the panel where there'll be a bit more interaction. There was a question about did you do any work on what amount of tax is generated from the sector? I think I know the answer.
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of answers to that. I think the few, but I mean the first is most of that sector will not pay tax on. It's primarily a cash sector. But what we don't consider are two other dynamics. The first is the stimulus of that sector on the economy. Look at cash builds figures recently, primarily supplying that sector and so on. But most of all, they all pay VAT, but they don't claim VAT. So there's a net benefit to the fiscus of the sector in terms of VAT payments. And VAT in many ways is a far more efficient way of extracting tax, particularly when you have environments like this.
Oh, no, interesting. It was fascinating. I found that really interesting. So, guys, Gigi will be on our township economy panel, which is, I think, in about 20 minutes. There's going to be a voice that'll emerge just now that'll tell you that there's about a 20-minute break for a quick something to eat. And I'm really looking forward to that panel. It's a significant panel, so we'll see you all then.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. The voice has emerged. As Rob said, we'll be going into a 20-minute break now. Please refresh your teas and coffees and join us back shortly for an incredible panel, and then we will hear from Theo Baloy as well.